What I want to do now is read an excerpt from the article, a couple paragraphs, and I think this adequately describes what the Beat Generation was and how the term Beatnik came to be, and this is right out of the article. The term Beat Generation was first coined by Jack Kerouac during a conversation he had with fellow writer John Cleland Holmes in 1948, using those words to describe the writers and poets that comprised his developing literary circle in New York City, while it was Kerouac himself who initially used the term beat in his debut novel, The Town and the City, in 1950, in which he alluded to a woman named Liz wandering beat around New York City. It was Holmes who completed the exercise and wrote extensively of the Beat Generation, a collection of writers, artists, drug users, hustlers, thieves, and down-and-out philosophers in his 1952 New York-based novel, Go. Holmes later authored an essay entitled This is the Beat Generation, which appeared in the New York Times Magazine on November 16, 1952, and attempted to define the very essence of the young people of the movement. He wrote that those of the Beat Generation harbored more than just weariness, but carried raw feelings of being used and endured a nakedness of mind and soul. Jack Kerouac countered in interviews by explaining that beat really meant beatific or sacred, and many interpreted his works as exercises in capturing the holiness of the downtrodden. While Jack Kerouac's first novel, The Town and the City, was not widely read, his second effort in 1957, On the Road, was credited for announcing, in effect, a new consciousness. It was a major event in the annals of Beat Generation literature and fostered a special magic with its undirected raw energy, prose poetry, and larger-than-life protagonists who zoomed back and forth across the country in search of thrills and experiences. As Beat Generation consciousness expanded during the late 1950s, San Francisco Chronicle reporter Herb Cain noted in the April 2, 1958 column, Pocketful of Notes, that Look magazine had hosted a party in a North Beach house for 50 beatniks in preparation for a forthcoming article on the subject. It marked the first time the term beatnik had ever appeared in print, and quickly became a moniker bestowed upon those who had ingratiated themselves into the Beat Generation world. The beatnik image was shaped by a wave of books and articles that projected images of shaggy, bearded, beret-topped, bongo-playing, marijuana-smoking men and sullen, straight-haired, black-dressed women. Okay, the Beat Generation emerged in Washington, D.C. In 1959, and it's centered around a rather remarkable individual named William Addison Walker, better known as Bill Walker. What we know about Bill Walker: he was from North Carolina. He came up to the D.C. area in the late 50s to attend George Washington University and entered their creative writing program. He obviously was a devotee of the Beat Generation literature, the poetry. He saw himself as a poet. He met a woman up here named Ruth Murray. They got married. And then the two of them decided to open a coffee house. And they called their coffee house Coffee and Confusion. The original version of Coffee and Confusion opened up on April 1st, 1959 in the 900 block of New Hampshire Avenue. They were only open for, I think, 6 or 7 nights. As soon as they opened up, they attracted other devotees of the Beat Generation. These were students mainly from George Washington University. The local article said they drew about 100 people per night. And of course the big attraction was the poetry readings. They would get up there on stage and basically anybody could get up and recite any type of poetry they liked. Of course it drew the attention of the local law enforcement authorities. They shut down Coffee and Confusion on April 7th, 1959, citing zoning regulations. However, Bill Walker was undaunted. Bill and Ruth then went looking for another place to relaunch Coffee and Confusion, and they came across the ideal spot in the basement of the old Zantzinger building at 945 K Street Northwest on the corner of 10th and K. The Zantzinger building was a 3-story Victorian. It had been built in the late 1800s and served as a private residence. It was basically just a Victorian house for about 40 years or so. In 1925, the real estate mogul Otway Berryman Zantzinger Sr. came along and purchased the entire building and moved his business in there. And over the decades, they had different restaurants in and out of the basement space. Bill and Ruth Walker found it somehow, and they relaunched Coffee and Confusion I think opening night there was June 9th, 1959, and it got a lot of publicity in the papers. Opening night they had a big competition between the DC Beats and the New York Beats. They invited people down from Greenwich Village, and they had a big poetry contest. And the DC contingency was pretty strong. You had guys who were well known within the local Beat Generation community. Bill Walker was kind of like the leader of it. They had a fellow named Dick Dabney, who worked at Coffee and Confusion. He later became a pretty respectable writer with Washingtonian Magazine and the Washington Post. He died in the early 80s. Dick Munsky was another fellow. He recently passed away. I talked with Dick. He did everything from, he was a cook, he was a bartender there, serving the coffee and drinks. He worked the door. Later in the 60s, he became, by his own admission, a LSD guru in DC, up in the Adams Morgan area. When I talked to him, he was retired out in West Virginia. Bill Jackson, a local poet, he got busted one time. They arrested him for some sort of obscenity, breaking obscenity laws because of his poetry. But the thing with Coffee and Confusion is that it became a gathering place for the Beatniks, for the Beat Generation, the people in Washington, D.C. at the time who followed the literature of the Beat writers, and they wanted to go here and express, go for the poetry readings and express themselves any way they liked. And that was a big attraction. Coffee and Confusion was a basement club. It was described to me as being very dark, very smoky. It wasn't that big. They had little round tables with chairs, and people would get up on this little makeshift stage and do their poetry reading, and then instead of clapping, the Beats would tap their spoons on the table. At some point, Bill Walker also started letting musicians come in, and they had some different types of jam sessions into the wee hours. It was open from 8 p.m. until 4 a.m., so people could come in here after the other nightclubs closed. A lot of musicians who went to Coffee and Confusion for these jam sessions remember going there. And I'm thinking of guys like Fred Jaschke, who played with Paul King and the Blue Knights at the Parkside on 14th Street, and Ron McDonald, who played with Ronnie and the Offbeats at different clubs. Jack Cassidy, the legendary bass player who eventually went and played for the Jefferson Airplane. He's now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He grew up in D.C. and played with a different bunch of bands around town. All these guys would go over to Coffee and Confusion for the jam sessions, and they said, in the wee hours after 2 a.m., the Beatniks got kind of brazen about smoking marijuana, out in the open, and they called it tea. So naturally, with all the publicity that Coffee and Confusion was getting, it was just a matter of time before the authorities came in and you had a major bust, and that's exactly what happened on April 1st, 1960. Now, the previous summer, a couple of guys who were involved with Coffee and Confusion broke away and opened another coffee house on Pennsylvania Avenue called Java Jungle. And so these were like the only two places in the city during this time where the Beats could go and hang out. They had a major bust at both Java Jungle and Coffee and Confusion on April 1st, 1960. They arrested 12 people. Java Jungle never recovered. They closed down. Coffee and Confusion was shut down very briefly, but then a very mysterious individual came onto the scene, and his name was Angelo Alvino. And Angelo Alvino is kind of a legendary character in D.C. I got to know his son, Angelo Alvino Jr., who maintains that his father was always a law-abiding businessman. What we know about Angelo Alvino Sr. is that in the summer of '59, he had purchased Bohemian Caverns, a nightclub up at 11th and U, and installed his friend Tony Taylor as manager. Angelo was a bongo and conga player, and he started hanging out at Coffee and Confusion. And what he did was, in April of 1960, shortly after this bust, he purchased 50% of Coffee and Confusion from Bill Walker. And then miraculously, Coffee and Confusion reopened and really didn't have any more troubles from police for the next until they got rid of the place in like April '63. So some attributed to Angelo Alvino's contacts and deep pockets. Nobody's really sure what happened, but he came into the scene. Eventually, Bill and Ruth Walker backed out and sold the entire club to Angelo Alvino, I guess at the end of the summer or early fall of 1960. Angelo Alvino maintained the poetry readings. That was a big attraction. He also kept the jam sessions going.